December 1944, the Ardennes. Snow drifts cling to the edges of shattered forests. The ground is hard, frozen, and soaked in blood. German infantrymen huddle inside half-collapsed bunkers, their breath turning to mist in the frigid air. The distant rumble of American armor echoes through the valleys, a sound they've heard before. But this time it's different. A strange, low hiss cuts through the cold wind. Then, a deep mechanical growl rises and suddenly, the horizon blooms into flame. A wave of liquid fire surges across the snow, curling through trenches, devouring timber, melting barbed wire. German soldiers scream as the inferno races toward them, their rifles useless against the advancing steel beast. The men of the Wehrmacht had faced Shermans before the dependable, steady American tanks that rolled forward in disciplined formations. But now, something new has joined the battlefield. The M4 Sherman Flamethrower, a machine born from desperation and innovation, turned conventional warfare into a scene from hell itself. The flames illuminated the forest like daylight. The air filled with the crackling roar of burning fuel, the metallic clank of tank treads, and the panicked shouts of retreating soldiers. For the Germans, it wasn't just another Allied tank, it was the embodiment of every nightmare a soldier could have in war. And as the firestorm swept across the front, a chilling realization spread through German lines. The Americans weren't just fighting to win anymore, they were fighting to finish it. Birth of the flame tank. It began far from the frozen forests of Europe in the sweltering jungles of the Pacific. The year was 1943, and the U.S. Marines were locked in brutal close-range combat across islands like Tarawa and Saipan. The Japanese defenders, hidden deep within caves and concrete bunkers, refused to surrender. Grenades and machine guns couldn't reach them. The battles became nightmares of smoke, screams, and stalemates. Commanders knew they needed something different, something that could root out the enemy where no bullet could reach. That's when the idea took shape, a tank that could breathe fire. In makeshift workshops on Pacific bases, American engineers began experimenting with a new weapon, the M4 Sherman Flamethrower, known by names like Zippo or Ronson, after the famous lighter brand that promised to light every time. Mechanics tore apart standard Shermans, replacing their main 75mm guns with high-pressure flame projectors connected to tanks of jellied gasoline napalm. When the first prototypes rolled out, even hardened soldiers stopped to stare. The sight of fire gushing from a tank's cannon, a jet of liquid flame stretching more than 150 feet, was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The weapon didn't just kill it and shattered morale. Reports soon reached command posts. Bunkers that had taken days to clear were now overrun in minutes. The Japanese, once fearless in their fortified positions, began to flee at the first glimmer of flame. The flamethrower tank had changed the rules of warfare, and the Americans knew it. So when production ramped up, it wasn't long before these infernal machines found their way across the ocean to the fields of Europe, where German soldiers would soon face the same horror the Japanese had once called the dragon's breath. Baptism by fire, the first Sherman flamethrowers in Europe. It was December 1944, the heart of a brutal European winter. Snow blanketed the scarred landscapes of Belgium and Luxembourg as the Battle of the Bulge raged in full fury. The German counteroffensive had shocked the Allies. Columns of panzer divisions tore through the Ardennes, ambushing convoys and swallowing entire towns in fire and chaos. Amid the chaos, a new kind of American weapon rolled into the fight, the Sherman flamethrower tank. Until now, these steel beasts had seen their horrors confined to the Pacific, but here in the frozen ruins of Europe, they would face their baptism by fire. In the misty morning chill, the first Zippo Shermans lumbered through small villages reduced to rubble, their treads crunching over shattered bricks and burned-out trucks. Infantry followed close behind, weary and cold, their faces tight with fear and anticipation. Ahead, a German machine gun nest had pinned down a platoon for hours. Every approach ended in blood. Then came the order. The Sherman edged forward, its turret rotating slowly, the flame projector angled toward the ruined farmhouse that concealed the enemy position. A brief hiss filled the air, followed by a roaring torrent of fire. A stream of blazing napalm erupted from the cannon, curling through the air like a fiery serpent, striking the building in a single deafening blast. Within seconds, the structure was engulfed, walls crumbling, ammunition cooking off, screams drowned by the crackle of inferno. The snow around the tank melted into blackened sludge. The men watching from behind cover were frozen not by the cold, but by awe. It wasn't just a weapon, it was judgment. The fire didn't just burn through concrete and steel, it burned through morale. German soldiers, who had once laughed off American armor as inferior, now stared in disbelief. They had faced tanks, artillery, and air raids, but nothing like this. The fire didn't stop when they hid. It reached into every corner, every trench, every darkened window. For the first time, the battlefield belonged not to the biggest gun or the heaviest armor, but to the flame. Fire and fear, German reactions to the Sherman flamethrowers. By early January 1945, the snow across Western Europe was no longer white. It was stained black with soot and ash, the aftermath of fire unlike anything German soldiers had ever faced. Word of the Flammenpanzer Sherman, as the Wehrmacht began calling it, spread through the ranks like a ghost story whispered around a dying campfire. German infantrymen, once confident in their ambushes, now hesitated before aiming their Panzerfausts. In the forests and ruined villages of the Ardennes, they had learned a terrifying truth. A Sherman with a flamethrower was not just a tank, it was a nightmare that moved. Reports flooded back to headquarters. Machine gun crews abandoned their positions before the tanks even came into view. Anti-tank teams melted away into the trees at the mere sound of those distinctive engines. The German high command, proud and defiant, could scarcely believe that entire units were retreating not because of heavy artillery, but because of fire. On the front lines, the sight was apocalyptic. When the Sherman's flame projector ignited, it wasn't just a weapon discharge, it was an event. A blinding jet of fire burst forth, curling and expanding, reflecting off the snow in dazzling, hellish light. The roar echoed through forests, bouncing off stone ruins, drowning out the screams of retreating soldiers. The flames snaked through windows, trenches, and bunkers, consuming air, oxygen, and courage all at once. In some cases, German soldiers simply surrendered on sight. White flags waved from smoking ruins before a single shot was fired. To them, being trapped in a bunker when the flamethrower roared was a death sentence worse than the bullet. The psychological shock was devastating. Veteran units who had faced the Soviet T-34s and British Churchills with grim determination now found themselves unnerved by an enemy whose weapon turned the battlefield into an inferno. Even panzer crews reported nightmares, dreams of fire creeping into their hatches, of oxygen vanishing as their tanks filled with smoke. The Allies didn't need to destroy every enemy position. Sometimes, just the whisper that the Zippo Shermans were rolling in was enough to clear a sector. Fire had become the ultimate force multiplier, not just burning through bunkers, but through morale, discipline, and the illusion of German invincibility. Engineering the inferno, how Sherman flamethrowers worked. Behind the terrifying spectacle of the Sherman flamethrower lay one of the most ingenious and chilling feats of wartime engineering. By late 1944, American ordnance specialists had realized that fire could succeed where even high-explosive shells failed. Bunkers, tunnels, and fortified buildings often shrugged off traditional shells. But fire? Fire seeped into every crack, every crevice. It consumed oxygen, melted steel, and broke human will. To create this weapon of terror, engineers began experimenting with the standard M4 Sherman chassis, converting it into a machine capable of unleashing liquid hell. The result was a family of modified tanks, the M4A3R3 Zippo, the POACWSH-1, and others, each armed with a flamethrower that could spew burning fuel over 150 yards. The heart of the system was a high-pressure fuel projector, usually mounted in place of the tank's coaxial or hull-mounted machine gun. Inside the Sherman's armored body were steel tanks filled with a thickened gasoline mixture, napalm's primitive ancestor. Compressors forced the sticky, flammable gel through narrow lines, and when the trigger was pulled, a jet of fire exploded outward, ignited by a small pilot flame at the nozzle. It was more than just a weapon, it was a storm of chemistry and physics. The mixture clung to surfaces, turning walls, vehicles, and even snow into blazing pyres. The roar of ignition was deafening, a deep, bestial growl that could be heard even above machine gun chatter. Crews described it as a dragon's breath trapped inside steel. Inside the tank, the operators worked with surgical precision. The gunner aligned the flamethrower's arc, calculating distance and wind like an artilleryman. The assistant handled fuel pressure, monitoring gauges to prevent dangerous backflow. Every shot had to be measured. The flame tanks carried only a few seconds worth of fire, but those seconds could decide the fate of a battle. The engineering brilliance of these Shermans lay not in brute force, but in adaptability. They could clear bunkers, trenches, and tunnels without risking infantry lives. They could flush out machine gun nests in seconds. And unlike earlier handheld flamethrowers, which left operators dangerously exposed, the Sherman flamethrower gave soldiers a shield of armor and mobility. What truly made this weapon revolutionary was the synergy of psychology and mechanics. The Allies didn't just build a machine to destroy, they built one to terrify. Fire had always been primal, but now it was tactical. It could force an entire garrison to abandon its post before the battle even began. As American commanders realized how effective these tanks had become, they began deploying them more strategically, pairing them with engineers and infantry, coordinating their attacks to crush resistance with mechanical precision. In the cold, bombed-out towns of Western Europe, the Sherman flamethrower had become something far greater than a tank. It was the embodiment of fear engineered to perfection, unleashed with purpose, and remembered by every German soldier who saw the night sky turn orange with its fire. Baptism of fire, the Sherman flamethrowers in action. It was February 1945, deep in the heart of the Siegfried Line, Germany's final wall of defense in the west. A gray winter sky hung low over the battlefield, the air thick with the acrid smell of cordite and frozen mud. American forces had been slugging forward for weeks, inch by inch, through a maze of bunkers, dragon's teeth, and barbed wire. The Germans had turned every hill into a fortress, every concrete pillbox into a miniature hell. Conventional artillery couldn't dig them out. Infantry assaults cost too many lives. But that morning something new rolled to the front. The M4A3 R3 Sherman flamethrowers, nicknamed Zippos, rumbled through the frost, their engines growling like caged beasts. Infantrymen stepped aside, eyes wide with both awe and unease. They knew what these tanks carried inside wasn't just fuel, but liquid fire. As they neared the front, the low thud of German MG-42s cracked through the mist, bullets sparking harmlessly off the Sherman's armor. The tanks didn't stop. They pressed on, steady, methodical like executioners approaching the gallows. At the lead, the gunner squinted through his periscope, spotting the mouth of a German bunker dug into the hillside. "Target acquired," he muttered. The commander gave the order. With a mechanical hiss, the flamethrower turret rotated, aligning perfectly. Then whoosh. A column of fire erupted forward, bright orange against the gray. The sound was indescribable, a roar that seemed to tear the air itself apart. The flame jetted outward, arcing nearly 100 feet, splashing across the bunker's concrete face. For a moment, the world turned to fire. The thick gel fuel clung to the walls, seeping into firing ports and ventilation shafts. The bunker's machine gun went silent. A muffled scream echoed, then nothing but the crackle of burning fuel. The entire fortification had been neutralized in less than 10 seconds. Nearby soldiers stood frozen, staring at the inferno. Even seasoned veterans admitted later they had never seen anything like it. One infantryman wrote in his journal, "It was as if the sun had touched the ground." The flamethrower tanks continued their advance, flushing out German positions one by one. Pillboxes that had held for days fell within minutes. Enemy troops emerged from trenches with their hands raised, terror written across their faces, not at the sight of tanks, but at the sight of fire. The psychological effect was overwhelming. The Germans had faced artillery, bombs, and tanks before, but nothing like this. Each blast of flame illuminated the battlefield, sending shadows dancing across the shattered landscape. Trees caught fire, Smoke rolled across the snow, and the sky above flickered orange like the end of days. Inside the Shermans, the crews worked with cold precision aiming, firing, reloading compressed fuel. They had become both engineers and executioners, wielding a weapon that could end a fight in a heartbeat. For the first time, American troops felt the tides of close-quarters combat tilt sharply in their favor. What had once been suicidal assaults now became controlled advances. The Sherman flamethrowers weren't just tools of destruction, they were instruments of momentum. They burned not just bunkers, but the very spirit of German resistance. And as night fell on the battlefield, the glow of distant fires marked the path the Shermans had carved a burning trail of victory through what had once been an impregnable line of steel and stone. The psychological warfare, fire as a weapon of fear. It was late February 1945, and the shattered villages along the Siegfried Line bore silent witness to a new terror. German soldiers had faced tanks, artillery barrages, and relentless infantry before, but nothing struck the mind like the M4 Sherman flamethrowers. The very presence of these tanks created a palpable tension, a dread that spread faster than bullets or shells. From the safety of foxholes and dugouts, German troops watched as the Shermans approached. The Engine's growl was no longer just a sound, it was a warning, a prelude to the inferno they carried. Soldiers whispered in terror, their eyes darting from the advancing tanks to the flames already consuming bunkers in the distance. Even hardened veterans, who had survived artillery bombardments and urban street fights, felt a chill at the mere sight of the Sherman's flame turret rotating, ready to unleash its fiery torrent. Commanders tried to maintain order, barking instructions over the din of chaos, but morale was fraying. Every time a flamethrower jet struck, panic rippled through the ranks. Some soldiers abandoned their positions, fleeing across open snowfields or into trenches that offered little protection from the advancing fire. Others froze, paralyzed by the sight of fuel-soaked structures erupting into roaring columns of orange and yellow, the air shimmering from heat and smoke. The psychological effect extended beyond mere fear. The Germans knew the Shermans could project fire over 100 feet, penetrating firing ports and bunkers, neutralizing entire strongpoints without the need for infantry to risk a step forward. This knowledge made every defensive line seem futile. Even well-fortified positions of reinforced concrete, steel embrasures were rendered terrifyingly vulnerable. Soldiers began questioning whether any position could survive this inferno, and hesitation set in where decisiveness had once ruled. Reports from German officers later described the flamethrower as a living nightmare, a weapon that burned not just walls, but confidence itself. Entire units hesitated to counterattack, knowing that one misstep could leave them trapped in a wall of fire. And for the American crews inside the Shermans, this psychological effect was an unspoken ally. The roar of the flamethrower was as powerful as its physical destruction. Every bunker ignited, every surrendering soldier reinforced the terror of the weapon. By mid-morning, the battlefield had transformed. Smoke spiraled into the gray sky, casting an eerie haze over the snow-smeared fields. Flames danced across the landscape like living creatures, creating a surreal, almost apocalyptic theater of war. German troops retreated to secondary positions, not because they were overrun by numbers, but because the fear of fire had already won the fight in their minds. The Sherman flamethrowers had proven that warfare was not only about steel and ammo, it was about mind, morale, and fear. In seconds, a single tank could make a position seem impregnable no longer, leaving the enemy disoriented, hesitant, and ready to surrender. The battlefield had become as much a psychological arena as a physical one, and the Shermans were the undisputed masters of this terrifying new front. Fire in the trenches, tactical impact on German defenses. It was March 3, 1945, and the frozen German trenches along the Siegfried Line were a maze of mud, barbed wire, and despair. For weeks, soldiers had fortified these positions, believing concrete, earthworks, and coordinated fields of fire could hold back any armored assault. But the arrival of the M4 Sherman flamethrowers shattered that illusion in an instant. From the snow-streaked fields, the flamethrower Shermans advanced with deliberate, relentless precision. The low rumble of engines masked the horror they carried, a stream of ignited napalm, shooting forth in a serpentine tongue of fire, engulfing bunkers and trenches alike. German infantry, accustomed to artillery barrages and machine gun fire, now faced an enemy that could project fire into their very shelter, rendering them vulnerable even behind walls of steel and timber. The tactical impact was immediate. Soldiers who had spent days reinforcing firing positions found their trenches consumed by fire, forcing them to abandon carefully planned defensive lines. Communication lines were severed as telephone poles and field wires ignited. Artillery observers and forward spotters, once essential to coordinating counter-battery fire, scrambled to escape the creeping inferno. Every defensive strategy seemed inadequate against the Sherman's new form of warfare. The psychological effect compounded the physical destruction. German units hesitated, unsure whether to mount a counterattack or retreat. Any movement drew fire. Even stationary positions were not safe. Soldiers reported that the flames licked the earth, moving unpredictably yet deliberately, consuming everything in their path. Foxholes were no sanctuary, sandbagged positions offered little protection, and reinforced bunkers became death traps when the flame projection penetrated their embrasures. American crews exploited these weaknesses with precision. Coordinating with infantry and artillery, Sherman flamethrowers systematically cleared strongpoints, forcing the Germans into precarious retreats across open ground where every step was a risk. Engineers and sappers followed close behind, consolidating positions and laying bridges over destroyed trenches, effectively turning the enemy's carefully constructed defenses into chaotic, broken landscapes. By late afternoon, entire sectors of the front line had collapsed without the Americans ever engaging in full-scale infantry assaults. The Sherman flamethrowers had turned entrenched fortifications into open terrain, dramatically reducing casualties for the attacking forces while amplifying the destructive psychological impact on the defenders. German officers would later write that the flamethrower was more feared than artillery, more decisive than tanks, a weapon that had fundamentally altered the calculus of trench warfare. Where once the trenches had promised security and leverage, now only fire and panic reigned. The Shermans had not just breached lines, they had annihilated the very concept of impenetrable defense, forcing German troops to rethink the art of holding ground in the face of fire that could not be contained. Breaching bunkers, Sherman flame tanks versus fortified positions. It was March 5, 1945, along the battered front lines of the Siegfried Line. German bunkers, once symbols of engineering precision and military pride, now loomed like grim monuments waiting for their reckoning. Reinforced with concrete and steel, their embrasures bristled with machine guns, and their interiors were stocked with ammunition and supplies. To the entrenched German defenders, these bunkers were supposed to be impenetrable, but the M4 Sherman flamethrowers were about to prove otherwise. The Sherman crews advanced cautiously through muddy, cratered terrain, their engines rumbling beneath the morning mist. Every movement was deliberate. Reconnaissance scouts had mapped out the bunker's layouts, and infantry provided suppressive cover. Then, with a hiss and a sudden roar, the flamethrowers ignited. Jets of napalm arced over sandbags, crawling into embrasures, and pouring through ventilation shafts. Inside, the air turned to hellish heat, smoke, and acrid fumes. Soldiers who had felt safe behind steel walls now found themselves trapped by their own fortifications, unable to escape the searing flames. The visual spectacle was horrifying and mesmerizing. Fire licked the concrete walls, wood splintered, and ammunition crates began to explode in a series of deafening blasts. The Shermans moved with surgical precision, pairing flame streams with cannon suppression fire to keep defenders pinned. German infantry tried to return fire, but the Sherman's armor made it almost impervious to small arms attacks, and any attempt to exit the bunkers exposed them to a torrent of napalm. Tactically, the Sherman flame tanks had redefined siege combat. What would have taken hours or days of artillery bombardment or infantry assaults could now be achieved in minutes. Engineers following close behind could enter the bunkers safely after the flames had cleared the interior, securing positions with minimal resistance. The combination of firepower and psychological terror forced defenders to surrender or flee, abandoning equipment and strongpoints in their wake. The German soldiers' accounts from that day described the flame tanks as unstoppable monsters, rolling inexorably toward their positions, leaving nothing but scorched earth in their path. Even hardened officers admitted that no amount of concrete or sandbagging could withstand the relentless heat and the terror it inflicted. Entire garrisons fell without the Americans ever having to breach the walls manually. The Sherman's flames had done the work. By nightfall, the front lines had shifted dramatically. Bunkers that had been considered death traps for attackers were now empty and smoking, a testament to the power of innovation and the devastating efficiency of flame as a weapon. The Sherman flamethrowers had not only conquered the fortifications, they had broken the will of the defenders, demonstrating that in modern warfare, the combination of technology, precision, and fear could achieve what brute force alone never could. Firestorm coordination, Sherman teams, and infantry synergy. As dawn broke on March 6, 1945, along the war-torn plains near the Siegfried Line, the battlefield was a tense choreography of fire, steel, and strategy. Sherman flamethrowers moved in coordinated pairs, their crews communicating through hand signals, shouted commands, and pre-planned maneuvers. Each tank was paired with infantry squads, advancing in perfect synergy while the tanks projected streams of scorching napalm into bunkers and foxholes. The infantry secured flanks, neutralized exposed machine gun nests, and moved forward to hold captured positions. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Mud splashed beneath treads, smoke from prior assaults hung low in the valleys, and the acrid scent of burning wood and chemicals filled the air. German defenders, who had hunkered down behind reinforced positions, now faced a combined assault of mechanized fire and relentless human determination. From the inside of the Sherman's armored hulls, crews could see their infantry signaling the next target, directing the flame with surgical precision, while simultaneously using the main cannon to suppress any remaining heavy machine gun fire. Every move was synchronized. As one Sherman projected its inferno into a bunker, another maneuvered to cover blind spots, creating a network of overlapping fire that left no safe avenue for retreat. Infantry squads used this advantage to storm trenches and secure supply points, while flamethrowers forced any remaining defenders into open ground, where small arms fire and tactical grenades could neutralize them efficiently. The battlefield had become a living system, a blend of mechanical terror and human coordination, each element enhancing the effectiveness of the other. The psychological impact on German soldiers was as decisive as the physical. They witnessed, often from exposed positions, the flames engulfing their comrades and fortifications alike. Panic spread, cohesion broke, and units that might have resisted for hours surrendered without a fight. Observers noted that it was this combination of tactical precision, armored protection, and relentless firepower that turned the Sherman flamethrowers from a simple weapon into an instrument of absolute battlefield dominance. By the afternoon, entire defensive sectors had been neutralized with minimal American casualties. Commanders on both sides recognized a grim reality. A Sherman flamethrower moving in coordination with infantry was not just a tank, it was a force multiplier, redefining how assault operations could be executed against even the most fortified positions. The success of these coordinated strikes would not only shape the remaining battles of the European campaign, but also leave a lasting impression on the German military psyche. Where the flame moved, resistance crumbled. Breaching the last strongholds, Sherman flame tanks in final assaults. March 7, 1945, dawned over the battered German countryside, the horizon lined with the jagged silhouettes of pillboxes and fortified bunkers that had long resisted conventional artillery and infantry assaults. The Sherman flamethrowers now faced their ultimate test, the last strongholds of German resistance along the Siegfried Line, positions so heavily reinforced that previous attacks had stalled, leaving American forces frustrated and weary. The scene was tense and cinematic. Smoke from earlier engagements hung in low banks across muddy fields, punctuated by the occasional flash of a distant artillery shell. Sherman crews adjusted their flame units and loaded secondary weapons, checking their fuel pressure and ignition systems with meticulous care, knowing that any malfunction could mean the difference between life and death. Infantry squads crouched behind debris, ready to advance as soon as the tanks initiated the assault. When the first Sherman projected its searing stream of napalm into the primary bunker, The effect was immediate and devastating. Flames roared over reinforced steel doors, smoke billowed into the morning sky, and defenders who had once felt invincible now scrambled in panic. The second tank flanked the first, cutting off escape routes and targeting adjacent pillboxes. Infantry followed swiftly, securing trenches and neutralizing machine gun nests, while coordinating closely with the tanks to ensure no blind spots remained. German soldiers, already psychologically shaken from prior encounters with Sherman flamethrowers, were now facing an orchestrated inferno on multiple fronts. Every bunker breached sent a ripple of fear through the remaining defenders, weakening their will to resist and breaking the cohesion of entire companies. The combined effect of firepower, armor, and infantry coordination created an unstoppable momentum, sweeping across the final defensive line like a tidal wave. Even terrain obstacles, muddy craters, barbed wire, and anti-tank ditches were overcome by careful maneuvering and engineering ingenuity. Sherman crews used minor earthworks and terrain features to shield themselves from sniper and artillery fire while keeping a continuous stream of flame directed at fortified positions. Each successive breach emboldened the crews and infantry, while simultaneously eroding the Germans' capacity to fight. By midday, entire sections of the Siegfried Line had fallen, many without a single close-quarter firefight, testament to the terrifying efficiency of the Sherman flamethrowers. Commanders documented the assaults as textbook examples of combined arms warfare, firepower, mobility, and coordination working in perfect unison. The battlefield now bore the scars of flame and smoke, a visual record of mechanized terror that would be studied in military academies for decades to come. The success of these final assaults demonstrated more than just firepower. It revealed the psychological dominance the Sherman flamethrowers held over even the most fortified and experienced German units. The flame had proven itself not merely as a weapon, but as a symbol of inevitability. Where the Sherman moved, resistance was extinguished, and the path to victory cleared. Coordinated fire and infantry support, maintaining the advantage. March 8, 1945, just a day after breaching the last strongholds, the Sherman flamethrower teams were still in motion, advancing deeper into German-held territory. The landscape was a mix of shattered villages, craters from artillery, and scorched earth where previous assaults had raged. Every foot of progress required synchronized action between armored flame tanks and infantry squads, an orchestration of movement, firepower, and timing that tested the limits of discipline and courage. The Sherman crews, aware that speed and coordination were critical, maintained constant communication with advancing infantry via radio and signal flags. The flamethrowers would soften targets' first pillboxes, machine gun nests, and barricades while infantry followed closely behind, clearing trenches, securing streets, and neutralizing survivors. Each Sherman moved like a spearhead, projecting a torrent of napalm that consumed wooden bunkers, barbed wire, and defensive positions alike, forcing German defenders into hasty retreats or surrender. The infantry, armed with rifles, grenades, and bazookas, relied on the Sherman's fire as both cover and psychological leverage. Soldiers pressed forward confidently, knowing that the flames would suppress enemy fire, mask their movement, and create opportunities to flank or storm positions that would have otherwise been deadly. Close-quarter combat was minimized, but where it occurred, the synergy between tanks and infantry proved decisive. The flamethrower cleared the path, and the infantry held it. German soldiers, now demoralized and disoriented by repeated encounters with the Shermans, were often caught in crossfires or forced into choke points, where flamethrower blasts combined with small arms fire made resistance futile. The Americans leveraged terrain intelligently, using natural cover, trenches, and roadways to maintain momentum while preventing counterattacks from regaining ground. The cinematic tension of smoke rising, flames roaring, and infantry advancing in tight, coordinated formations created a visual of unstoppable mechanized dominance. Even minor obstacles, like crumbled walls or debris-strewn streets, were overcome through collaboration. Engineers cleared paths for tanks, while infantry secured flanks and protected crews from sniper fire. Every movement was deliberate, every burst of flame calculated, and every squad knew its role in the larger assault. By evening, multiple villages had been secured with minimal American casualties, showcasing how the combination of armor, firepower, and infantry coordination created a tactical advantage that German defenses could neither predict nor withstand. This segment demonstrated that the Sherman flamethrowers were not just tools of destruction, but instruments of combined arms mastery where mechanized firepower and human coordination met to maintain momentum, exploit fear, and systematically dismantle the enemy's ability to resist. The battlefield bore the marks of strategy, discipline, and psychological dominance, highlighting why the Sherman flamethrowers became one of the most feared weapons in the final months of the European campaign. Post-battle analysis: the legacy of the Sherman flamethrowers. March 10, 1945. After weeks of relentless combat across the ruined villages and forests of Germany, the battlefield lay quiet, marked by scorched earth, toppled bunkers, and the lingering smoke of destruction. The Sherman flamethrowers had proven themselves not only as weapons of fire but as instruments of psychological warfare, reshaping the dynamics of infantry assaults against fortified positions. Analysts and military historians would later note how these tanks forced a re-evaluation of defensive tactics, as traditional pillboxes, trenches, and fortified towns could no longer guarantee protection. The Sherman's dual role of physical destruction and fear induction had left an indelible mark on German morale. Soldiers reported being trapped by walls of flame that seemed impossible to counter, while officers recognized that entire defensive strategies had to be reconsidered in the face of mechanized firepower. Even heavily fortified positions, which might have resisted conventional artillery or infantry assault, were neutralized effectively when flame tanks and infantry acted in coordinated harmony. Technical assessments highlighted the Sherman's versatility. Its flamethrower attachment, while cumbersome, integrated seamlessly with the tank's mobility and armor, allowing crews to approach bunkers and defensive emplacements with minimal exposure to small arms fire. The psychological impact of a roaring napalm stream, combined with its destructive capability, accelerated enemy surrender and reduced prolonged engagements, which in turn lowered Allied casualties and sped up advances in late-war operations. Strategically, the success of Sherman flamethrowers influenced post-war armored vehicle design, inspiring further integration of specialized assault weaponry within standard tank platforms. Lessons learned included the importance of coordinated fire and infantry support, tactical planning, and psychological considerations, highlighting that warfare was no longer just about raw firepower but about synergy, innovation, and battlefield adaptability. Photographs, after-action reports, and eyewitness accounts all underscored one truth: the Sherman flamethrowers had changed the face of urban and fortified warfare. Where traditional tanks faced limitations against hardened positions, the Sherman's flame could breach, suppress, and intimidate, leaving German troops stunned and defenseless. By the final days of the European campaign, these tanks had become a symbol of both technological innovation and psychological dominance, cementing their legacy in the annals of World War II history. The battlefield, now calm, bore witness not only to destruction but to a new paradigm of combined arms strategy where mechanized flame, coordinated infantry, and tactical planning converged to redefine the very nature of assault warfare. The Sherman flamethrowers were more than machines. They were instruments that turned fear into a weapon, reshaped enemy perceptions, and left an enduring mark on military history.